That Christmas Eve, snow blanketed all of Vermont. In the brilliantly lit mansion, the sound of laughter and clinking wine glasses echoed through my parents' and aunts' and uncles' lavish party. They talked about work, new contracts, expensive gifts, but not a single person mentioned my grandfather. Then amidst the thick curtain of snow, my grandfather's old pickup truck pulled up. He stepped out wearing a faded wool coat, clutching a small gift bag in his hand. He smiled and gently knocked on the door. But instead of a warm welcome, he was met with cold glances and polite rejections, light as a breeze yet cutting like a knife. I sat in front of the screen, frozen. No one in that house knew that the gift he carried that night was the final gift for the entire family, a gift that would change everything. Hello, my name is Adriel Holloway. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of my life. I'm 28 years old, living in Burlington, Vermont's largest city. I'm a software engineer, leading a life that anyone looking from the outside might call fine. But the truth is never that simple. Some days I feel like the code I write, precise, efficient, but soulless. I'm not the type to wear my emotions on my sleeve. Perhaps that's why I chose this career, programming, where everything follows logic and rules. I usually get to the office early in the morning, grab a quick breakfast sandwich from the vending machine, and dive into lines of code until the office lights are the only thing left glowing in the building. But I haven't always lived like this. In my memories, life was once as vibrant as summer sunlight filtering through the maple trees in Maplewood, a small town tucked deep in the heart of Vermont. That's where my grandparents, Aldo and Emmy Holloway, spent their entire lives. It's also where I found the most beautiful days of my life, those childhood summers when everything was still simple, warm, and full of meaning. My grandfather, Aldo, was an extraordinary man. At 80, he still carried the resilient bearing of a veteran who had walked the line between life and death in the Vietnam War. But the war didn't harden or chill him. On the contrary, he had a warm heart, hidden behind calm eyes as if he had seen too much loss to care about fleeting vanities. He loved simplicity, cherished authenticity. After retiring from the military, he opened a small woodworking shop behind his wooden house in Maplewood. It wasn't a large shop, just enough space for a workbench, a few wooden shelves, and some old tools. But to me, it was a magical world. Every summer, my parents, Aiden and Patricia, would send me to Maplewood to stay with my grandparents. I still remember the excitement when the car pulled up on the gravel path leading to the wooden house, where the scent of maple leaves mingled with freshly cut wood and the faint aroma of cinnamon tea. Grandpa Aldo would be waiting on the porch, his silver hair glinting in the sunlight, his calloused hands waving to me with a gentle smile. "Welcome back, Adriel," he'd say, his voice warm and deep like the crackle of firewood in the hearth. Those days in Maplewood were when I truly lived. Every morning I'd follow Grandpa to the workshop where he taught me the smallest things: how to choose a good piece of wood, how to hold a hammer to drive a nail straight, how to paint evenly so the wood's color shone like a painting. "Every handcrafted piece carries the soul of its maker," he'd often say, his eyes lighting up as he watched the wood take shape under his hands. As an 8-year-old kid, I didn't fully grasp the meaning of his words, but I loved watching him work. Loved the way he poured care into every tiny detail, as if every chair, every shelf, was a story he told through wood. My grandmother Emmy was the perfect complement to him. She was a kind woman with prematurely silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She was always busy in the kitchen preparing fragrant batches of baked goods or brewing hot cinnamon tea. Sometimes she'd stop by the workshop carrying a tray of pastries, smiling as she watched her husband and grandson hard at work. "Don't let sawdust get on my grandson's face, Aldo," she'd tease, her voice playful, as if the whole world existed just for the two of them. Evenings in Maplewood were my favorite. The family would gather around the fireplace, its golden glow casting warmth on the old wooden walls, creating an inexplicably cozy atmosphere. Grandpa would tell stories of the battlefield, not heroic tales, but simple memories of his comrades, of freezing nights in Vietnam, or the time he received a letter from Grandma back home. She'd sit beside him, sewing or knitting, occasionally looking up at him with gentle eyes as if embracing every word he spoke. I'd sprawl out on the old rug listening, transported to another world where war, loss, and love wove together into a melody both epic and tender. Whenever I got good grades at school, Grandpa Aldo would take a small piece of wood, carve my name into it with his sharp knife, and hang it on the workshop wall. "So you'll remember, Adriel," he'd say, "that you've done things to be proud of." I can still picture those wooden pieces dangling on the dusty wall, each one a memory, a word of encouragement from him. To me, he wasn't just my grandfather. He was a symbol of peace. But now, sitting in my cold Burlington apartment, I realize those summers are far behind me. They linger somewhere in my memories like old photographs faded by time. I don't know when it happened, but I began to let my grandfather, the man who taught me to love simplicity, to cherish authenticity, fade into a forgotten corner of my life. Work, lines of code, late nights at the office, they've pulled me away from Maplewood, from the workshop, from him. I told myself I was busy, that I'd call him over the weekend, that I'd visit soon. But those promises, like wood shavings scattered on the workshop floor, were swept away by the relentless current of time. Tonight, as the moonlight reflects on Lake Champlain, I suddenly think of him, of his calm eyes, of his words about the soul in every handcrafted piece. I wonder, in the lines of code I write, in this life, where have I left my soul? Or am I just functioning like a perfect machine without a heart? That question weighs heavy on my chest, as if a silent storm is approaching, carrying premonitions I can't yet name. I close my eyes and memories pull me back 7 years to when I was 21, when my world and my grandfather's changed forever. That was the year my grandmother passed away. A sudden stroke took her from us so quickly that no one had time to prepare. I still remember that day when my father called, his voice trembling, a stark contrast to his usual stoicism. "Adriel, your grandmother is gone," he said, and I stood frozen in my college dorm, the phone slipping from my hand, hitting the floor with a harsh clack. The funeral was held at a small funeral home in Maplewood, where the old wooden walls seemed to absorb the grief. Only a few of my grandparents' old friends and close neighbors attended. They stood in a quiet circle, their weathered faces, gentle handshakes, and whispered condolences forming a somber tableau. Grandpa Aldo stood by the coffin, his calloused hands clasped tightly, his eyes vacant as if half his soul had left with her. I stood beside him, wanting to say something, but my throat was choked with emotion. All I could do was place a hand on his shoulder, hoping he could feel my presence, though it could never fill the void she left behind. From that day on, I knew that for my grandfather, half his world was gone. The wooden house in Maplewood, once filled with laughter, the smell of freshly baked goods, and the scent of cinnamon tea, now felt cold and eerily silent. Everything remained exactly as it was when she was alive. The worn armchair where she used to knit, her framed photo on the dining table, even the handkerchief she'd embroidered still resting on the sofa. Grandpa Aldo couldn't bring himself to touch anything, as if moving a single item would make her disappear completely. But the truth was, she was already gone, and the house was now just him, a 73-year-old man quietly facing his loneliness. He still went to the workshop every day, still picked up the saw, still carved, but I could tell the joy in him was gone. Before, he worked with passion, humming old folk songs, sometimes whistling along to the tunes from the ancient radio. But now, the workshop echoed only with the steady, wordless rhythm of hammer strikes. No songs, no music. At the time, I was in my final year of college, buried in coursework, internships, and the invisible pressures of preparing for adult life. But I still made an effort to drive to Maplewood every weekend. The road from Burlington wasn't long, but each time I stepped onto the wooden porch, it felt like returning to a place where time stood still. I helped him clean, fixed the leaky porch roof, or simply sat with him at the dining table, sipping tea in silence. I tried to share funny stories about bombing a class presentation or nearly falling asleep during an exam. But no matter how hard I tried, I could see the loneliness enveloping him, like a thick fog I couldn't dispel. After graduating, I threw myself into the grind at Burlington Tech Solutions. In the early days, I still made an effort to keep up my visits to Grandpa. But then, work began to sweep me away. Endless projects, late nights debugging code, and relentless meetings gradually reduced my trips to Maplewood. I told myself I'd call him, that a phone call would be enough. I bought him a mobile phone, a simple model with large buttons, thinking it would make staying in touch easier. But Grandpa Aldo didn't care for machines. "They make me tired," he said, his voice tinged with mild frustration but still gentle. He rarely used the phone. I sent texts asking how he was eating, how the workshop was going, but I'd often get short replies, or none at all. Our phone calls dwindled from a few times a week to a few times a month. Each time I heard his voice over the phone, I felt an invisible distance. Not just the 60 miles between Burlington and Maplewood, but an ocean of neglect. I blamed myself, but then made excuses. Work was hectic, city life was too fast, I didn't have time. I thought he was fine, still there in the wooden house with the workshop out back. But deep down, I knew I was letting him drift away, like a boat unmoored on a river. And I didn't realize that in the quiet of Maplewood, my grandfather, the man who once meant the world to me, was silently grappling with a loneliness greater than ever before. Grandpa Aldo had 3 children. My father, Aiden, the eldest, Uncle Case, the middle child, now living in New Hampshire, and Aunt Ivani, the youngest, who had married and settled in Maine. When I was young, I heard Grandma tell stories about how all 3 of them used to cling to their parents, running around the yard, laughing in the woodworking shop where Grandpa Aldo taught them how to hold a hammer, how to carve. But as they grew up, each chose their own path, and those paths led them away from Maplewood, away from the wooden house where they were raised. Even before Grandma passed away, their visits home had become infrequent. My father, Aiden, and my mother, Patricia, lived just an hour's drive from Maplewood, but they were consumed by their furniture store in Burlington. That store was my father's pride, a thriving business supplying high-end furniture to luxurious homes and large hotels. My parents were regulars at social gatherings, glittering events filled with laughter and handshakes with business partners, where they boasted about new contracts. On the rare occasions they mentioned Grandpa Aldo, I could hear the impatience in my father's voice. He's old, but he clings to that workshop, refusing to change. Uncle Case was different. Living in New Hampshire, he worked for a large construction company. Whenever I asked about Grandpa, he'd give a faint smile over the phone, saying he was swamped with work but would visit when he had time. That time never came. Aunt Ivani, the youngest, had settled with her family in Maine. She'd call on Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas, but her voice was always rushed, as if she were merely fulfilling an obligation. "Is Grandpa doing okay, Adriel?" she'd ask. But I knew she wasn't really waiting for an answer. After Grandma's death, that distance became even more pronounced, like an invisible wall rising between Grandpa Aldo and his children. Promises of visiting soon were endlessly postponed from one week to the next month. My parents, Uncle Case, Aunt Ivani, each had their own reasons: work, family, life. But deep down, I knew they had begun to see Grandpa as a relic of the past. A stubborn old man living in a creaky wooden house, refusing to move to a nursing home despite my father's repeated suggestions. I remember one evening at my parents' house in Burlington, overhearing my father complain to my mother about Grandpa. "He won't adapt," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "He just stays in that old house, never listening to anyone." My mother stayed silent, offering a strained smile as if the issue didn't concern her. I sat there, holding my plate of food, unable to swallow. I wanted to say something, to defend Grandpa, but I just bowed my head and let the conversation pass. My father and Grandpa Aldo always saw the world differently. My father was pragmatic, always looking forward, believing success was measured in money and reputation. Grandpa Aldo was the opposite. He lived for the simple things. Their conversations were rare, and when they happened, they often ended in heavy silence. I once witnessed my father suggest that Grandpa sell the wooden house and move to the city, closer to family. Grandpa just looked at him, his eyes calm but piercing, and said, "This is my home, Aiden. It's not just wood and nails. It's a lifetime." Then he shook his head, turned away, and no one said another word. Still, I knew Grandpa loved my father. Sometimes when I visited, he'd invite a few neighbors over for tea, and he'd talk about my father as a boy, about young Aiden trailing him in the workshop, eager to learn carving, or the time Aiden caught his first fish in the nearby lake. Each time he told these stories, he'd smile, his eyes lighting up as if reliving those days. But then he'd fall silent for a long time, as if realizing that the boy named Aiden was gone. I'd sit there listening, my heart heavy, knowing he didn't just miss my father. He missed the family that once gathered together, now scattered like smoke. The estrangement wasn't loud. It didn't come from big arguments or bitter accusations. It came from empty dinner tables where Grandpa's plate sat alone, from unanswered phone calls, from promises of next time that no one kept. I wasn't blameless either. Though I tried to visit him, those trips grew less frequent, swept away by the demands of my job in Burlington. I sent gifts, sent texts, but I knew they couldn't replace an afternoon sitting with him, listening to the sound of his hammer in the workshop. On the rare occasions I managed to call him, asking if he needed anything, he'd just chuckle over the phone, his voice warm but weary. "I'm fine, Adriel. As long as you're doing well, I'm happy." But I could hear the loneliness in his voice, like a discordant note in a symphony. I told myself I'd visit soon, that I'd spend a whole day fixing the porch roof, drinking tea with him, reminding him I was still there. But then I let work pull me away again, let lines of code and late nights drown out that promise. Then came the autumn of this year, bringing with it cold winds and the brilliant gold of maple leaves blanketing the road to Maplewood. My grandfather, Aldo, was about to turn 80. I received a call from him on a Saturday morning while I was sitting in my Burlington office, eyes glued to the computer screen. His voice over the phone was different, not the usual weariness, but a rare excitement, as if he were clinging to a spark of light in his heart. "Adriel, I'm planning a small birthday party this year," he said, his voice crackling like firewood in a hearth. "Just family. Can you make it? Don't bring anything. Just your smile is enough." I smiled through the phone, my heart warmed but tinged with guilt. "I'll try, Grandpa," I replied, even as my mind flashed to my packed schedule. A project due soon, a client meeting, and a pile of unanswered emails. But his voice, full of hope and joy, made it impossible to say no. I knew deep down this wasn't just a birthday party for him. It was a chance to feel the warmth of family again, something he'd lost since Grandma passed away. Grandpa Aldo called each of his children, my father, Aiden, Uncle Case in New Hampshire, and Aunt Avani in Maine. He told me about it later, his voice radiant as he shared that all three had promised to come early with their families, bringing gifts and joining him to blow out the candles. "It's been so long since the family gathered, Adriel," he said, and I heard a fragility in his voice, as if he were pouring his entire heart into the belief that this time, everyone would show up. In the days leading up to his birthday, I pictured him in Maplewood, quietly preparing. I imagined him sweeping the wooden house, dusting off old picture frames, arranging chairs around the dining table. I saw him standing in the kitchen, kneading dough for apple pie, the scent of cinnamon and brown sugar filling the air, just as Grandma used to do. He must have carefully written little name cards for my father, Uncle Case, Aunt Avani, and all the grandchildren, placing them thoughtfully at each seat. I pictured him by the window, gazing out at the leaf-strewn road, his calm eyes bright with hope, waiting for the sound of cars pulling into the yard. The day of his birthday arrived, a crisp autumn day with a clear blue sky and lazy white clouds drifting by. In Burlington, I was racing against time in the office, my eyes bleary from staring at the screen too long, my fingers typing furiously to finish a final report. I told myself that if I wrapped up early, I could drive to Maplewood before dark. In my mind, I saw Grandpa Aldo vividly, wearing his old flannel shirt, standing by a neatly set dining table, candles on the apple pie, a gentle smile on his weathered face. I imagined the family gathered around, laughter filling the air, singing an old birthday song, and him sharing stories from the past as he used to do by the fireplace. But work didn't let me go. An unexpected system error forced the team to stay late, and I was swept into a tangle of code and urgent calls with colleagues. The clock ticked on, minute by minute, hour by hour, and when I finally looked up, it was pitch dark outside. Nearly 10 p.m., I escaped the office, jumped into my car, my heart heavy. The road from Burlington to Maplewood felt longer than usual, each turn pulling me into a growing sense of unease. I berated myself, but also reassured myself that Grandpa would understand, that the family must have shown up, that he wasn't waiting alone. As I turned onto the leaf-covered road leading to the wooden house, an eerie silence enveloped me. No sound of cars, no glowing lights from the windows, no hum of a party. The house stood quietly in the darkness, with only a faint golden glow spilling from the dining room. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding, sensing something was wrong. When I pushed open the door, the sight before me left me frozen. The dining table was perfectly set, just as I'd imagined. Clean plates, little name cards with everyone's names, the apple pie in the center with a candle long burned out. But there was no one. No father, no Uncle Case, no Aunt Ivani. Just Grandpa Aldo, sitting alone at the head of the table, his hands clasped tightly on the tablecloth, his eyes tired but forcing a smile when he saw me. "Adriel," he said, his voice hoarse, "you made it." I said nothing, only walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. His frame was frail, trembling slightly under the old flannel shirt. We sat there in heavy silence for a long time. I didn't need to ask what had happened. The promises from my father, my uncle, my aunt, they were empty words, scattered like the fallen maple leaves outside. He had waited from morning to night, believing they were just running late, as they always did, but no one came. I pulled up a chair, cut a slice of the cold apple pie, and placed it in front of him. "Let's eat some pie, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, picked up a spoon, but I saw his hand tremble. I warmed up a pot of cinnamon tea, its familiar scent filling the air, but it couldn't dispel the chill in the room. We drank tea, ate pie, and I tried to talk. About work, about Burlington, about the time I spilled coffee on my office keyboard. He didn't laugh out loud, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly, his eyes briefly lighting up like a faint ray of sun through clouds. I gave him my gift, a small wooden frame I'd made myself, holding a photo of him and Grandma from the summer when I was 8. "So you'll remember those days," I said, my voice catching. He held the frame, his fingers tracing the wooden edge, and smiled. "Thank you, Adriel," he said, and I saw a flicker of light in his eyes, however fleeting. As I left, I looked back. He stood in the doorway, his small figure framed against the darkness, the dining room's light casting a glow on his face like a somber painting. The sight made my heart ache. It was no longer a birthday party. It was a gathering for waiting, for broken hopes, and for a resilient man who still managed to smile despite a heart full of scars. The drive from Maplewood back to Burlington that night felt longer than ever, not because of the distance, but because of the heavy thoughts pressing down on my chest. I drove in silence, with only the whistle of the wind through the window and the headlights sweeping across rows of trees nearly stripped of their maple leaves. The image of Grandpa Aldo sitting alone at the dining table haunted me. I kept asking myself, why didn't anyone show up? Why did my father, Uncle Case, Aunt Ivani, the people he called family, leave him waiting in vain? And me, even though I made it at the last minute, I couldn't erase the loneliness he endured that entire day. After his 85th birthday, Grandpa Aldo returned to his routine in Maplewood. He still went to the workshop every morning, still picked up the saw, still carved. But I sensed a quiet change in him, a subtle, invisible crack that no one, not even I, could fully see. Perhaps it was his eyes, now dimmer like a fireplace fire about to die out. Perhaps it was his voice, still warm but quieter, as if he'd learned to keep his sorrow to himself. I called to check on him, asking if he was okay, and he always replied, "Everything's fine, Adriel." But I knew behind those words was a void that couldn't be filled. In Burlington, I was swept back into work. One project followed another, late nights debugging code, meetings stretching into the early hours. But despite the busyness, I tried to maintain the habit of sending Grandpa gifts every weekend. Sometimes a box of cookies from a favorite Burlington bakery, sometimes a jar of apple jam I made, though I knew he rarely touched them. I included short notes. "Grandpa, I'm busy this weekend, but I'll try to visit next week." He didn't reply much, just the occasional, "Thank you, Adriel. I'm fine." But each brief message from him brought a mix of comfort and guilt for not being there more. On the rare occasions I had a moment to breathe amid the chaos, I called him. I talked about work, about a funny colleague at the office, or the time I nearly ruined a project by forgetting to save a file. He listened, chuckling softly over the phone, but I could tell he was trying, as if the smile was for my sake, not his own. Deep down, I knew he was lonely, and I was powerless to change that. In contrast to the quiet of Maplewood, my parents' life in Burlington grew ever more vibrant. They expanded Holloway's furniture and design, signed bigger contracts, and attended glittering social events. My father, Aiden, was always on calls with business partners, while my mother, Patricia, was busy with charity events and lavish dinners. They never once mentioned Grandpa Aldo's birthday, as if it had never happened, as if the image of him sitting alone at the table wasn't worth their attention. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time I saw them laughing in photos on social media, a quiet anger simmered in my chest. During a rare family dinner at my parents' house, I couldn't hold back any longer. I brought up the birthday, keeping my voice steady. "Dad, Mom, why didn't anyone show up for Grandpa's birthday?" My father paused mid-bite, glanced at me briefly, then brushed it off. "Everyone was busy, Adriel," he said dismissively. "You know how it is. Work doesn't wait." My mother offered a strained smile and added, "I heard Uncle Charles sent a late card and Aunt Ivani called to wish him well a week later." Grandpa understands. I looked at them, the people I loved most, but they felt like strangers. To them, Grandpa Aldo was fine because he never complained. In their minds, his silence meant everything was okay. Vermont slipped into an early winter that year. Burlington's streets were adorned with twinkling Christmas lights, glittering trees, and the cheerful buzz of people talking about holidays and gifts. But amid the festive atmosphere, my thoughts were with Grandpa in Maplewood. I pictured him sitting by the fireplace, Grandma's framed photo on the table, his calm eyes gazing out at the snow-covered window. I made a promise to myself that this year would be different. I would come home early, spend all of Christmas with him, and not leave him alone like on his birthday. I wanted to see him smile, to hear him tell old stories, to bring him a bit of the family warmth he longed for. But I didn't know that this Christmas would change everything. Burlington glowed with lights as December draped the streets in white snow. Twinkling Christmas trees, the jingle of bells from shops, and the festive buzz of the holiday season filled the air. But amid the lively city, my thoughts were with Maplewood, with Grandpa Aldo sitting quietly in his wooden house by the fireplace next to Grandma's framed photo. His 80th birthday, with the cold apple pie and unclaimed name cards, still cut into my heart like a knife. I didn't want him to endure another moment of loneliness. My parents, Aiden and Patricia, decided to host a grand Christmas party at their Burlington home. They wanted everything to be perfect: a table draped in white silk, wine glasses sparkling under the chandelier, a menu crafted by a chef from the city's finest restaurant. Uncle Case from New Hampshire and Aunt Ivani from Maine were invited, along with a few close neighbors and business partners. My mother excitedly described the guest list, detailing how they'd make the party the event of the year. But when I asked about Grandpa Aldo, my father replied curtly, "His health is weak, Adriel. It's too cold for him to travel." His tone was flat, as if it were an obvious excuse. I looked at my father, searching his eyes for a trace of sincerity, but I saw only avoidance. Deep down, I knew it wasn't concern. My father was embarrassed or simply didn't want Grandpa there. An old man in a worn flannel shirt with his war stories and woodworking tales among their sophisticated guests. This callousness wasn't new. It had crept into the family over time, through broken promises, unanswered calls, and the birthday no one attended. But this time, it left me breathless. I grabbed my phone and called Grandpa Aldo. "Grandpa, come to Mom and Dad's for Christmas," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. "I want the whole family to celebrate together." He chuckled over the phone, his voice warm but tinged with surprise. "I'm still fine, Adriel. I'll come. I've got a special gift for the family, too." I offered to drive to Maplewood to pick him up, but he refused. "I can drive myself, don't worry. I don't want to trouble you." I smiled, picturing him preparing his gift. Perhaps something he'd crafted himself, like the small bookshelf he gave me when I graduated. But deep inside, a sense of unease crept in. I didn't want him driving alone in the freezing weather, but his voice was resolute, and I knew I couldn't persuade him otherwise. On Christmas Eve, I was stuck at the office with an urgent project. Buggy code kept me tethered, and despite my efforts to finish early, the clock ticked past 7 p.m. I opened the security camera app for my parents' house, wanting to see the party's atmosphere. The screen showed a dazzling dining table with my parents, Uncle Case, Aunt Avani, and guests laughing and talking. Wine glasses gleamed, Christmas music played, but Grandpa Aldo was nowhere to be seen. My heart sank. He said he'd come. Where was he? Then the front porch camera flicked on. I saw Grandpa Aldo's old pickup truck pull up in the yard, its headlights cutting through the thick snow. He stepped out wearing a heavy brown coat, clutching a small gift bag, his steps slow but steady. He knocked gently on the door, his face kind, his eyes sparkling with joy. The door opened. My father, Aiden, appeared. He froze when he saw his father. Grandpa Aldo's smile remained, but my father's eyes turned cold. "Go home, Dad," Aiden said, his voice low and firm. "This party isn't suitable for someone old and frail." "You shouldn't be out in this weather," I froze in front of the screen. Grandpa Aldo stood there, silent. My mother appeared, her demeanor hesitant but cold. She stood behind my father, saying something in a soft but cutting tone like a winter gust. "Go home early, Dad. It's cold. You'll get sick. We're busy with guests, it's not convenient." From inside, Uncle Case's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. "Dad, go rest. It's not safe to be out in this weather." Then Aunt Avani's voice, laced with mockery as if he were a burden. "Really, you don't think about us at all. We told you not to come." Each word was a cold, cruel slash tearing apart his fragile hope. Grandpa Aldo stood there, silent for a long time, his hands gripping the gift bag, his calm eyes filled with hurt. Then he nodded slightly, turned and walked back into the snow, his small figure fading into the white. The gift bag remained in his hand, like a promise no one wanted to accept. Their callousness left me stunned. My father, who once trailed Grandpa in the workshop laughing by the fishing lake, now stood there, shutting the door on his own father without hesitation. My mother, who once learned to make apple pie from Grandma, looked at him like an uninvited guest. Uncle Case, who used to boast to friends about his veteran father, now shouted as if Grandpa were an obstacle to their perfect party. And Aunt Avani, the youngest, once carried on Grandpa's shoulders through maple fields, now mocked him like a stranger. They didn't see how he'd prepared, how much he'd hoped. They didn't see, or didn't want to see, that he hadn't come just for a party, but to reclaim a shred of the family warmth he'd lost long ago. I called him, my hands trembling as I dialed, but no one answered. I called again, over and over, hearing only the endless ringing. My heart felt crushed. I threw the phone down, grabbed my coat, and rushed to the car. The snowstorm was intensifying, the wind howling through the windows. Snow blanketing the road, but I didn't care. I drove through the night from Burlington to my parents' house, consumed by anger and pain. What had they done to him? How could they treat him like that? like an outsider, like a memory not worth keeping. When I arrived, the party was still in full swing, laughter echoing from the dining room as if nothing had happened. I stormed in without knocking. My parents, Uncle Case, Aunt Ivani, and the guests startled at my entrance. "Why did you send him away?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "I saw everything on the camera. He came here, brought a gift, just wanted to be with family, and you chased him off like he was nothing." My father stood abruptly, his face flushed. "Adriel, you don't understand adult matters," he snapped. "He's old, frail. How could he handle this weather?" My mother looked away, staring at her wine glass, muttering something about how he shouldn't have come. Uncle Case sighed, grumbling, "You're ruining the mood." Aunt Ivani just shook her head, her voice cold. "Adriel, you're overreacting. It was best for him to go home." Their indifference hit me like icy daggers. They didn't mention him again, didn't apologize, showed no remorse. The party went on with laughter, clinking glasses, and meaningless talk of contracts and vacations. I looked at them, my parents, my uncle, my aunt, my closest family, and felt like I was standing among strangers. Grandpa Aldo had poured his heart into that visit, into the small gift he carried, into the hope of being with his family. And they had rejected him, not just with words, but with a cold indifference, as if he were no longer their father, the man who had built an entire world for them. I couldn't stay in that room for another minute. The sound of their laughter, the glittering light from the chandelier, the smell of fine wine and gourmet food, it all suffocated me. I turned and stormed out, not looking back even as my father called my name. The snowstorm raged outside, snow blanketing the road, but I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove straight to Maplewood. The road was shrouded in haze, the headlights barely piercing a few meters ahead, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be with him, to tell him I was sorry, that I was still here, that he wasn't as alone as they had made him feel. The drive from Burlington to Maplewood that night felt endless. The wind howled through the windows, snow clung to the wipers, and my heart pounded in my chest. I called him again over and over, but the phone just rang unanswered. The image of Grandpa Aldo walking away in the snow, clutching that small gift bag, played on a loop in my mind, each replay stabbing my heart with pain. I blamed myself. If I hadn't been stuck at the office, if I'd insisted on picking him up, if I'd been there when he arrived, maybe things would have been different. As I turned onto the gravel road leading to the wooden house, a faint golden light spilled from the window through the white curtain of snow. The house glowed softly like a small lighthouse in the storm. I stopped the car and stepped out, my feet heavy in the thick snow. The front door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of old wood and cinnamon tea hit me. But it no longer brought the warmth it once did. Grandpa Aldo sat in his familiar wooden chair by the fireplace, clutching Grandma's framed photo, his eyes tired but kind, as if he had accepted everything. His face, etched with deep wrinkles and crowned with white hair, looked like a faded painting, both sacred and painful. I sat down beside him silently, unable to speak. Apologies, explanations, all stuck in my throat. He nodded slightly as if to say it was over, that he wasn't angry, just saddened by his hope. But I saw the pain in his eyes, deep and undeniable, like a scar that would never heal. After a long silence, Grandpa Aldo set the photo down on the table with slow, almost reverent movements. He reached for the small gift bag, the one he'd brought to the party. I thought it was a Christmas gift, but when he opened it, there was only a folded piece of paper inside. He handed it to me. Under the dim light, I realized it was a will. His handwritten will, the trembling but clear script notarized and signed. My heart raced. "Grandpa," I whispered, but he raised a hand, signaling me to be quiet. "Adriel," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I once thought I'd divide my estate equally among my 3 children. Over $10 million from investments and shares I've built up over the years. I wanted them to have a good life, as your grandmother and I always wished." He paused, gazing at Grandma's photo, his eyes clouding. "But after tonight, I realize they don't need it. They don't need me anymore. His words hit me like a hammer to the heart. I wanted to protest, to say he was wrong, that my father, Uncle Case, and Aunt Avani still loved him. But the image of them standing at the door, coldly turning him away, left me speechless. Grandpa Aldo continued, "Tonight I just wanted to bring a little joy to the family. But they didn't want me there. And I understand, Adriel. I understand." Then a knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I stood and opened it to find an older man with silver hair and a slightly stooped posture standing on the porch. It was Walter Green, Grandpa Aldo's old war buddy, once a prominent Vermont lawyer. He carried a briefcase and a notary seal, his expression serious but warm. "Aldo called me over," Walter said, his voice deep. "He needs my help with something." Grandpa Aldo gestured for Walter to come in. Walter opened his briefcase, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began writing as Grandpa dictated. In the dim light, the room was so quiet I could hear the scratch of the pen on paper. Grandpa Aldo spoke, his voice calm but resolute. 50% of my estate I want to go to the Vermont Veterans and Seniors Fund. It's my way of giving back to life, for letting me survive the war, survive every loss. He paused, looking at me, his eyes brightening slightly. The other 50% I leave to Adriel, because you're the only one who still makes me believe in love and kindness. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I'd heard. "Grandpa, you can't," I stammered, but he shook his head, a gentle but pained smile on his lips. "This is my decision, Adriel. Not about the money, but because you've shown me that there's still someone who understands the value of simple things." Walter finished drafting the will, notarized it, signed it, and tucked it into his briefcase. He shook Grandpa Aldo's hand, their eyes meeting in a wordless understanding between old war comrades. When Walter left, the house fell silent again, with only the sound of the wind slipping through the doorframe, carrying a sense of both sacredness and destiny. I sat back down beside him, unable to speak. My heart was heavy, not because of the money, but because of the meaning of his decision. A decision that was both a farewell and the final lesson he left for me. I sat there, beside the old wooden chair, the firelight from the hearth casting shadows on Grandpa Aldo's face, highlighting the wrinkles like the long roads he had traveled. He said nothing more, only gazed out the window where snow fell silently, blanketing the road to Maplewood. I wanted to say I didn't need his estate, that I only wanted him to stay, but I knew words were meaningless now. He had made his decision not out of anger, but with a sad serenity, as if he had seen through everything and chosen to let go. The next morning, snow still covered the path, so thick that each step left a deep imprint. I woke early before dawn could pierce the gray clouds. The wooden house was strangely quiet, with only the crackle of burning logs in the fireplace. Grandpa Aldo was still asleep, or so I thought, in his old armchair, Grandma's framed photo still in his hands. I didn't want to wake him, didn't want to disturb that fragile peace. I took a piece of paper from his desk, sat down, and wrote a letter to my parents. My hand trembled as I wrote, but I knew I had to do this, not just for me, but for him. The letter was brief. "Grandpa left me more than money. I only wish you could understand why." I folded the paper, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked in a copy of the first page of the new will. The page bearing Grandpa Aldo's signature, Walter Green's notary seal, and a short note, "Estimated estate value exceeds $10 million US." Each line, along with the clear notary seal, was like a final declaration. I didn't want my parents, Uncle Case or Aunt Avani, to mistake this for a matter of money. I wanted them to see that Grandpa's decision was a message about kindness, about family, about the values they had forgotten. On my way to work, I stopped by my parents' house in Burlington. The snowstorm had calmed, but the air remained bitterly cold, as if trying to freeze the thoughts in my head. I placed the envelope on the snow-covered doorstep and left quietly. I didn't want to see them, Didn't want to hear their justifications or arguments. I just wanted them to open the envelope, read the words, and feel the emptiness they had caused. A few hours later, as I sat in my office, my phone buzzed incessantly. My father's name flashed on the screen, then my mother's, then Uncle Case's, and even Aunt Ivani's. I watched the calls come in one after another, but didn't answer. I didn't want to hear their explanations, their blame, or anything they might say to ease their consciences. I wanted them to face the truth, the will, and what they had done to Grandpa Aldo on Christmas Eve. I wanted them for once to feel the void he had endured, the void weighing on my chest. That afternoon, as the sky turned leaden gray, an uneasy premonition stirred within me. I couldn't focus on work. The words on my screen became meaningless. The image of Grandpa Aldo standing at my parents' door holding the small gift bag, his eyes sad but still forcing a smile, replayed in my mind. I wondered if they had gone to his house bringing accusations, shame, or anger over the will he had mentioned. That feeling pierced my heart. I couldn't bear the thought of him facing them alone in that cold house in the dead of winter. I grabbed my coat, rushed to my car, barely remembering if I'd locked the office door. The road to Maplewood was familiar down to every curve, but today it stretched endlessly. The wind howled, snow fell heavily again, and with each mile my heart raced faster, as if I were running against something I couldn't yet name, the fear of loss again. When I arrived, I saw 3 familiar cars parked in the yard, my parents', Uncle Case's, and Aunt Ivani's. Beside them was an ambulance, its red and blue lights flashing, reflecting off the white snow like cold, sharp blades slicing through the night. My heart pounded, a chill running down my spine. I parked, stepped out, my breath turning to mist in the freezing air. Questions flooded my mind. What had happened? Had my parents come and caused a scene, letting things spiral out of control? Each step in the snow was deafening, like a ticking clock in my head. The wooden house's door was wide open. I stepped inside, the warmth mingling with the faint smell of medicine and incense. In the front room, my parents, uncle, and aunt were arguing, their voices overlapping in chaos. "We called the ambulance, but they're too slow," my father's voice rang out, sharp with a hint of panic. "I told you not to leave him alone," Uncle Case snapped back. My mother whispered something, her voice trembling, while Aunt Ivani sobbed, but no one listened to each other. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching them, feeling as if I'd stepped into a distorted scene, where everyone spoke loudly but no one truly grieved. I quietly moved past them toward the small room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it gently and everything seemed to stop. Grandpa Aldo lay on his old bed, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest, Grandma's framed photo beside him. He was gone. I knelt, taking his cooling hand, feeling the familiar roughness of fingers that once held a hammer, that carved my name into pieces of wood. Tears didn't fall, not because I wasn't in pain, but because the pain was too vast, a hollow void in my chest that swallowed every emotion. I don't know how long I sat there. Outside, the wind whistled through the doorframe, mingling with hurried footsteps and muffled whispers in the living room. Everything faded, leaving just me and him. I looked at him, so strangely peaceful, as if he had followed Grandma's call, the woman he still spoke of with tender eyes. And in that moment, I understood. He had left me more than an estate. He left me a final lesson, that money can be divided, but kindness cannot. He chose me not because I was better than anyone else, but because I was the only one who stayed, who remembered him, who cherished what he had held dear. The small room was bathed in the faint golden glow of the fireplace, but the chill of Vermont's winter seemed to seep into every corner of the walls, every breath. Grandma's framed photo lay beside Grandpa Aldo as if they had reunited in an eternal dream. I wanted to say something, to whisper a goodbye, but my throat tightened, leaving only a vast, painful void in my chest. The sound of hurried footsteps from the outer room snapped me out of my thoughts. My parents, Uncle Case and Aunt Ivani, burst in, their faces filled with panic, but not the kind born of losing a loved one. My father, Aiden, strode toward me, eyes red with anger, his voice trembling. Adriel, where's the real Will? Don't tell me you tricked him into giving you all the money. My mother, Patricia, stood behind him, hands clenched, her eyes wavering between fear and suspicion. How did you get him to change the will like that? She asked, her voice sharp as a blade. Uncle Case cut in, his tone harsh. I knew it. This kid was always hanging around him, whispering in his ear. Aunt Ivani, with a twisted smile, sneered, Adriel, you think you can keep $10 million to yourself? Don't dream. The small room filled with the clamor of arguments and greed. No one looked at Grandpa Aldo lying there. No one offered a word of farewell. No one bowed their head to the father and grandfather who had spent his life loving them. They cared only about the will, the money, the things they thought they deserved. I stood frozen, their accusations pelting me like hail, but instead of anger, I felt only a deep sadness. They didn't see him, didn't see the scars on his heart, didn't see the small gift bag he brought on Christmas Eve, didn't see his eyes when they turned him away. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, but my voice was strangely calm as I spoke. I didn't take anything from anyone. This was Grandpa's decision. He chose this, and I'll honor his wishes. Not a single cent will go to those who turned their backs on him. My words landed like a stone in a still lake, silencing the room. My father stared at me, eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe I'd dare say such a thing. Adriel, you, he growled, but couldn't find the words to continue. My mother stepped forward, her voice shaking. You're no longer our son. If you keep that money, don't expect us to let it go. Uncle Case and Aunt Ivani turned away, storming out in a fury, their curses echoing through the cold house. When they left, the door slammed shut, the sound ringing like a final note. I stepped to the bedside, took Grandpa's rough, cold hand and bowed my head. Goodbye, Grandpa, I whispered so softly only I could hear. Thank you for everything. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because the pain was too great, like a silent storm sweeping away all emotion. 3 days later, I organized Grandpa Aldo's funeral myself. No lavish flowers, no expensive wreaths, just a simple wooden coffin as he had lived, humble yet dignified. No family came, not my parents, not Uncle Case, not Aunt Ivani. Only a few neighbors from Maplewood, their weathered faces and heavy eyes filled with sorrow, and his old war comrades, elderly soldiers in uniform, came to salute him one last time. They stood in a line, silent as the late winter wind swept through the cemetery, carrying the scent of snow and incense. During the funeral, they took turns sharing stories about Grandpa Aldo, the kind carpenter who fixed neighbors' porches for free, the brave soldier who saved comrades in war, the man always ready to help anyone in need. One veteran, Walter Green, stood up, his voice trembling. Aldo wasn't just a soldier. He was a father, a friend, a man who lived his entire life for kindness. I stood there listening to each story, feeling him still present in their words, in the cold wind and the swirling incense. The late winter wind blew through the cemetery, biting but clear. I stood alone by his grave, the simple yet dignified headstone engraved with Aldo Holloway. I felt more clearly than ever that solitude, too, has its own dignity. He had lived a full life, not for money or fame, but for the kindness and love he gave his family, even when they turned their backs on him. The days after the funeral, I returned to Maplewood to clear out Grandpa's wooden house. The task felt like a sacred ritual, like stepping into a museum of memories. Everything remained as it was when he was alive. Grandma Emmy's framed photo on the fireplace, her gentle smile frozen in time. The old wooden chair by the hearth, its armrests worn smooth by his touch. The unfinished pieces of wood in the workshop still dusted with sawdust as if waiting for his hands to complete them. I walked through each room, every corner whispering stories of my childhood summers. The scent of cinnamon tea, the sound of a hammer striking, the warm laughter of Grandpa. The house seemed to mourn, its silence louder than any words. On his writing desk, I found an old leather journal, its pages yellowed, the edges curled. I opened it, my hands trembling, and read the final entry in his careful, steady handwriting. You take nothing with you when you leave except the way you loved. I traced each word, feeling their weight sink into my chest. It was his final gift to me, a reminder that the true value of a life lies not in what you accumulate, but in how you love. I closed the journal, clutching it tightly, and silently vowed to live in a way that honored that truth. I decided to keep the wooden house in Maplewood, not to cling to the past, but as a sanctuary to preserve his spirit. With part of the inherited estate, I established a fund to support orphaned children and lonely elders in Vermont, a way to carry forward the kindness he quietly sowed throughout his life. I wanted my share to continue his legacy, touching lives the way he touched mine. With the remaining assets, I chose to live simply, returning to my work at Burlington Tech Solutions. But something in me had changed. The relentless grind of code and deadlines no longer consumed my mind. I began to notice the small things: the morning light dancing on Lake Champlain, a colleague's laughter, the warm smile of a stranger. Grandpa Aldo had taught me to see the soul in the ordinary, and I carried that lesson like a torch to guide my way. A few weeks later, I returned to the Maplewood Cemetery. Winter was thawing, the snow reduced to patchy white on the grass, revealing the first green sprouts. The air was crisp, carrying the breath of spring to come. I knelt by his grave, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers and a wooden plaque I had carved myself. On it I wrote, "Aldo Holloway, the man who built more than wood. He built hearts." The letters were uneven, my hands not as skilled as his, but they carried the truth of who he was. I sat there, the cemetery's silence wrapping around me like a blanket. I looked at his name on the headstone and spoke softly, as if to myself, "You were right, Grandpa. It's not what we take, but what we leave behind." I understood that the greatest legacy a person can leave is not money or possessions, but kindness, compassion, and the way they treated others while alive. Grandpa Aldo built more than objects in his workshop. He built bridges between hearts, even if not all those he loved crossed them. If I could say one thing to the world, it would be this: if you still have parents, grandparents, go visit them. Call them. Hold their hands. Say thank you while there's still time. Because family cannot be measured by wealth, and no will can preserve love that comes too late. I learned this from Grandpa Aldo, not through his words, but through the way he lived, the choices he made, and the quiet strength he carried to the end of his life. I stood up, gazing at the pale gray sky where clouds parted to reveal a final ray of daylight. In that light, I felt a peace spreading through me, as if he were still watching over me, his gentle smile reassuring me that I was not alone. I turned and walked away, my steps light on the thawing ground, carrying his legacy with me one step at a time.